Welcome to the Juice Box with Juice Springsteen, covering the week that was in professional wrestling. And hello there, I am Juice Springsteen. Welcome to this special edition of the Juice Box, because it's not really the Juice Box. I just wanted to come on here before we present to you here at the Juice Box the newest show, as it were, a series, if you want to call it that. Main Event Maniacs. It is presented underneath the Juice Box umbrella. I'm very excited to welcome in Brian and Jay to discuss the history of pro wrestling via main events. You know, main event by main event. TNA, WWE, WCW, AEW. As they say, the main event can make or break the show, no matter how good the undercard is. If the main event's great, it's something worthwhile, and if it's not, you remember it for the worst parts. I was presented with this idea from Brian and Jay to discuss one main event and, before, after, how it actually took place, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between about the main events and the biggest main events in the history of professional wrestling. So that is what we're bringing to you here with Main Event Maniacs. I just wanted to present this pilot episode to you guys. Next week, we will be getting the first true episode of Main Event Maniacs, where the guys will be discussing Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant, WrestleMania 3, March 29th, 1987, from the Pontiac Silverdome in Detroit, Michigan. Arguably the greatest, biggest, most important pro wrestling main event in the history of the sport. So without further ado, here's the pilot episode that these two fine gentlemen pitched to me. You get to learn a little bit more about them. For Main Event Maniacs, the pilot episode. And don't forget, next week, Hogan versus Andre, WrestleMania 3, Main Event Maniacs. Brian, Jay, it's all you, right here on the Juice Box.
Main Event Maniacs, presented by the Juice Box.
Welcome to Main Event Maniacs, presented by the Juice Box. The main event can make or break a show. Doesn't matter how good the undercard is. If the main event's a stinker, the entire thing can be tainted. On this show, we will revisit some of the most memorable main events in sports entertainment history, good and bad, across various promotions and eras of professional wrestling. I'm Jay, and now to bring in the Arn to my Tully, good friend and co-host, Brian. Brian, what's up, man?
Hey, Jay, I'm excited about this project that we're just getting started with. Wrestling, you and I have been, that's how we bonded. Many moons ago was over a wrestling radio show that I used to host, and we've talked wrestling for years. And I've been sitting around going, I want to do a podcast again, and you threw out the option of, hey, what about talking about main events and stuff? I'm like, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, and we reached out to our buddy Juice Springsteen at the Juice Box. We've both known him for a good while and followed his work, and he's trying to expand what the Juice Box offers. And we know what it's like as podcast creators, that you have all the ideas in the world, but you only have so much time. So when you can tag in some other people, it always helps to have a stable behind you, if you will. So we pitched this to him, and Juice was like, yeah, guys, go with it. And so we're this is kind of an episode 0, I guess, of Main Event Maniacs. We're going to talk about what the show is going to be, and talk a little bit about broaden our backgrounds as wrestling fans, and talk a little bit more about how we got here and what we're hoping to do with this. But I'm pumped about it too, man. It's we've been doing podcasting in some form or another for a long time, but I've never done a full-time wrestling thing. You've had a couple of different iterations of that through the years, and I would pop on and off of them, but it's been a while since we've done any of that. And like you say, we keep up with it still. We have a text chain that when the PLEs are going on, we're talking about it with each other and some other buds. And so this idea was born out of the original idea was, let's do every WrestleMania main event in chronological order, and then we realized real quickly, that's going to get really tedious at some point. Plus, it leaves out cool stuff that I didn't grow up WWF was my primary wrestling thing. I grew up in the South, so NWA, WCW was my thing. And during the Monday Night Wars, man, we had 2 TVs going, and so
yeah.
a lot of times I would fall on that side. And I know you're a big TNA fan. And then there's ECW, there's ROH, there's even AEW's new stuff. There's lots of good main event promotions out there.
Yeah, and we talked about that, but there's so many stinkers at WrestleMania too that it's like, do I really want to cover that? There's controversial stuff that I don't know that I want to get into it either. And then, like you said, there's just so much out there. And I guess we should really talk about kind of our backgrounds as wrestling fans. And I'll go first. My wrestling fandom really started around 1986. I was a young kid, and my babysitter would bring over like 3 or 4 different wrestling cassette or VHS tapes that she had, and she would pop those in, and we would, as kids, just sit in front of there. At least myself and then my brother would sit in front of that TV, and we'd watch these wrestling events over and over again. Like every time she came, we we're like, "Did you bring the wrestling tapes?" And it was the same stuff. She had WrestleMania 2 on it. She had a bunch of AWA stuff with Pretty Boy Doug Summers and Playboy Buddy Rose taking on the Midnight Rockers. She had basically the whole feud from that on a tape. Just all sorts of things from all over the place. And it got me hooked. And of course, Hulk Hogan was my hero growing up. And, I remember one time they had the Saturday Night's Main Event on, and my mom came running and going, Hulk Hogan's on TV. Hulk Hogan's on TV. And that was the one where Paul Orndorff turned on him. And it was like, oh, so much good memories of that. And so I grew up being a wrestling fan, and then about high school time I got myself into music and stuff, and kind of stopped watching wrestling for a while. And then 1996 comes around, and I hear Hulk Hogan and Roddy Piper are fighting each other again in the WCW, and I'm like, I gotta check this out. And so I tuned in once again to watch that feud take off, and then from then on I was a WCW guy. I watched everything WCW, went to college, and just like you, I had a hallmate across the hall who was a huge wrestling mark. He was into tape trading and everything. He introduced me to that world, and we would have our doors open on Monday nights, both of us running 2 different TVs so we can watch both Raw and Nitro at the same time, and we would run back and forth through the halls talking about what just happened and this and that, and ever since then I've been a huge fan. TNA, when WCW went out of business, I jumped on the TNA bandwagon week 1. I remember I bought the pay-per-view week 1, and I bought almost every single weekly pay-per-view that they did. I would have my brother-in-law over to watch those with me. And I started the TNA Revolution website and message boards, and ran that for several years. And then once TNA kind of lost TV coverage for that black period, I had no way to watch them anymore. And then, of course, everything got kind of screwed up with Pop TV and everything that they did since, and kind of fallen off the TNA bandwagon. And then AEW comes around. Big fan of that. Big fan of watching WWE again. So yeah, that's my kind of story with everything.
Well, like I said, I grew up in the South, so got a lot of NWA, WCW on TBS, Saturday night's Main Event, and, got to see Ric Flair in really the prime of his career. And, I remember watching guys like Mike Rotunda and Dr. Death Steve Williams and the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express, every version of that, the Freebirds. But I'll tell you what turned me on to wrestling initially. My parents, were strict about some things, but our entertainment, they were always like very loose with. And I think it's because my dad just had this real adventuresome side. And this movie called Highlander came out, and he saw it on like Showtime. And if you know anything about the front of that movie, it opens up with the Highlander at a wrestling match in Madison Square Garden where the Fabulous Freebirds are taking on, I don't know who they may have been taking on the Von Erichs. I can't remember who it was, but or the Bolsheviks, one of those. And it was nuts. But I remember watching that with him going, what is that? I was more into that than it was Highlander. And I started watching wrestling. I started catching World Class Championship Wrestling because it was on like ESPN Classic.
Yeah.
So the Iron Claw movie that came out, man, I'm like, I knew all that. It was just fun to watch it in a movie. I say fun, it's sad, but it was neat to see it come to life. But I knew all of that. You know, I knew all of those guys. I remember the Ultimate Warrior was the Dingo Warrior, Blade Runner Sting. You know, and so then again, I was a big WCW guy, but I remember when I realized wrestling was a big thing was on the nightly news, the 6 p.m. sportscast, they gave away the finish to WrestleMania 5 when Hulk Hogan got the belt back and he beat Macho Man Randy Savage. They showed like the little vignette, and I thought, wow. And now I'm like, how in the world did they get that? I had no idea how it was the CBS affiliate, I think, that got it, but or maybe in the NBC, that would actually make more sense. But anyway, I remember like going, okay, WWF is like wild cartoon wrestling. That's what I called it on Saturday mornings. And then like the grappler stuff, the stuff I was really into was on Saturday nights. And I was a big Ricky Steamboat mark. I still love him. And his trilogy with Flair in the late 80s is some of my favorite stuff. And so I watched all of that. Like you, watched it all through, high school into college. I got into music in a big way. Was doing a lot more with that. Kind of walked away from everything else except that for a while. But then the Monday Night Wars started, and I got into a campus ministry. And the dudes of the ministry had a thing called Wrestling in the Word, and we would get together and have a Devo together at this guy's house. Alan, rest in peace, Alan's great dude. But he would have us all over at his house. We would do like an hour-long devotional, and we'd order pizza, and he had a long cable from his bedroom, and we'd pull one TV in, we'd have WWE on one, and we'd have Nitro on the other one, and whatever was cool at the moment, we would mute one and turn on the other. And we were just sitting there and watching all of it, and did all of that stuff. And then I ended up through work and stuff I was doing, I was working in newspapers at the time, had a friend who was helping run an independent promotion in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and I ended up being their ring announcer for a while. So I got to do Millennium Wrestling Alliance for a while, and then they had like a video camera a couple times, and I tried to be Jim Ross, and I sucked at it. But that led me to actually getting broadcasting jobs calling football years later, because the guy who had done the thing before me had come from wrestling. And the radio producer said, well, if you can call that, you can call football. And he's not wrong. And so I just stayed in it. And then with the advent of the internet and the availability to find stuff, I didn't get to see a lot of pay-per-views till after the fact as a kid. So we would rent the tapes, and or I'd have a friend that like recorded somehow, and we'd all watch it at his house, or I would read about it in the magazines. Like I think I read about WrestleMania 6 before I ever saw it. Like the Color magazine was amazing back in those days. And so with the advent of the internet, like I say, there was access to all this stuff. I could start watching it just on demand, it seemed like. And I would do DVD trades and tape trades with people on eBay and all that kind of stuff to get the things I wanted. And then when the WWE Network became a thing, and I just had this library of stuff in front of me, I've been a subscriber to that in one way or another, all the way through, and will continue to. It's really the reason I have Peacock. And, that and the random Halloween movies that we got to review on Film Strip that popped up there. But yeah, I mean, I've just stayed with wrestling. And then as I've gotten older and stuff like that, I've made friends like you and Juice and our buddy Presto, and Ron that we've done Film Strip with is a wrestling fan. He's a big ECW guy, so he'll tag in, and Nick, does. And so I just have friends that I talk with it about, and it's fun to me. And my wife kind of watched it on and off or whatever, but then she had one she really liked. And so she would always watch like John Cena with me, and she'd watch Randy Orton. She loves those guys. And she loves Roman Reigns. She's real pissed that he got beat. So I was like, listen, but it had to happen, baby. It was 2 years. But I mean, but we have fun with that. And so, but it's fun. It's still fun to keep up with. And what I think is neat about this concept is, we're both lifelong wrestling fans. We've been connected to the business in some ways. You running websites, doing tape trading. I had that short stint actually doing stuff with it in the creative, which was a lot of fun. And still remember that. I talk about that job all the time. And I was only in it for like maybe 6 months, but man, I remember a lot about it. And it taught me a lot about how to think on my feet and move. And I know how to dodge a pane of glass real quick. But I don't know if I can do it like I used to, but I did back then. And but it's fun to think about, where the business has gone, and it's definitely had ebbs and flows and stuff. But right now, it's popular to say, but I think it's true, Brian. Professional wrestling is cool again, man. It's just, and there's a lot of it you have access to now.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to think about it in that sense. We got to see one of the biggest boom eras in wrestling with the Monday Night Wars and the NWO and the Attitude Era going head to head, and that's pretty cool. And nobody ever thought it would ever get that popular again, because we're talking millions of people every Monday watching wrestling. And while the ratings don't look that big, you got to remember there's a ton of people out there who are cord cutting, and they aren't counted in the ratings per se. They're in that DV plus 2 to 7 day window that they never share with us, so we don't even know what that's like. So I'd be curious once WWE gets to Netflix, how are they going to talk about how successful they are? Because there aren't ratings for Netflix. That's going to be streams, number of streams. And then how do you count that? I think we're in a new era of how you determine what is successful or not. And I agree with you. I think this is as popular as it's been since those Monday Night Wars. And it's an exciting time to be a wrestling fan.
Yeah, and I mean, again, there's so many different avenues for it, and you can see it too in the live shows and the tours that are going around. They're selling out. All these promotions are really hitting max potential in a lot of ways. And I know it's kind of a fun thing on the internet to poke fun at AEW sometimes and ROH, so some of these places, because they're in arenas that are too big for what they're trying to do, but they're growing and they're offering true alternative. And that's the one thing that I like about wrestling, is that I think it's at its best when you have alternative and variety. And I think because I grew up watching it that way, I felt like I had, what was going on in Texas, which was, a totally different thing than what was happening out of Atlanta and the Carolinas with WCW and NWA. And then the WWF was its own thing. It was a different stratosphere. And I liked all of it. I sampled a little bit of every bit of it. It was like the Golden Corral or whatever of wrestling. And I felt like we're at that again. And that's what's fun here. And we're going to talk about all these different main events and things. And some of them are going to be good, some may be controversial, but they're notable in some way. And that's what's going to be fun, is we're here to celebrate that and talk about what works, what doesn't, all that stuff. And we'll kind of go through what our format's going to look like in a minute. But I'm fascinated by the idea of because I think now more than ever we live in a behind the scenes culture. There's so much access to like how things are made, and even the WWF now is or WWE and AEW are putting out like behind the scenes stuff on their social media. That we've pulled the curtain back so far now, and nobody's afraid of that. And you and I grew up in the era when they still maintained kayfabe on a serious level with the public.
Oh, yeah.
And now that we don't, and they're not scared of it anymore, like we know how the magician's trick is done, but I still want to see it. It's even more fun. And that's what's fun to go back and kind of retrospect and look at these things, is now we have a lot of documented history and we've got a lot of interviews, and some of it overlaps itself and contradicts itself. And that's the fun part of sort of parsing out, is how these things come together. But man, there's nothing like watching a show and getting to that end, and when they hit the crescendo and it really works, right? But we've also watched them where it leads up to it and it's just a big it just falls apart.
I always say, back in the day, the WWF or WWE, whatever you want to call it, they would put on a crap card and then have a killer main event. And then you'd go home thinking this is a great show. WCW would just kill it in the undercard, and then they would put the main event on and it'd just be a stinker. And you think, man, this show stinks, right? It can make or break a show, and how you think about it. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be fun. We have a huge list of events that we can choose from. We've started thinking about, and I wanted to make sure that it was a good enough list of things that were both good and bad, right? Because we want to talk about both of them and how that affected the show, the angles, the promotions, all that kind of stuff going forward. So I'm really looking forward to doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of lay out the format of how we're going to do it, we'll jump on and do an intro every week, and then we're going to talk about the build up and so how we got to that point. And sometimes it's a year or 6 months. They're building for a long time. Sometimes it's quick and they're just doing a thing and hitting the iron while it's hot. And we're going to try to set the scene, which is all the behind the scenes stuff. that's going on. You're really kind of the historian between the two of us, so you bring in a lot of knowledge from various resources and lots of things. We'll try to quote things, and give credit where credit's due. We will talk about the actual match. I don't know that we'll go blow by blow through it, but we got to talk about like the thing, right? What went down, the spots that worked, if they missed something, because sometimes that's just as fun to try to pick out and notice. And then I think the fun parts you're talking about the aftermath. Like that's always the neat stuff is once it's over, what do they do? Because we can talk about. I remember WrestleMania 6, and like I talked about, I read about it forever. It was such a big deal. As a kid, the Ultimate Warrior took out Hulk Hogan, and then it was like, and then what? And the answer was they didn't know, and it didn't work, and they had to reverse course quickly. And so that, and then we already do something else too that we call fantasy rebooking, which is where you and I are going to like, well, if we had to fix this or change it, what would we do?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the fun part right there. Sometimes you won't need to do a whole lot. Other times, you're going to need to fix something that just didn't work out the way it probably should have, or you would have hoped, right? Yeah. So I'm looking forward to doing a little bit. We're not going to get too in depth. We're not going to like book the whole match or anything, but just talk about what you would have changed with the match and how you would have had the finish go.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that's always the fun part as a wrestling fan is what would you do? How would you do it differently? And then we'll get to all of that. But I'm looking forward to breaking these down, talking about them, and like you say, really going through a large history of some of the biggest and best and wildest main events that are out there. And should reiterate, we're going to hit the big ones, obviously from the WWF, WWE era, the WCW era, but we're going to get the other promotions in there too.
Absolutely. I've pulled stuff from TNA. We got stuff from ECW. Might look at some things from a Ring of Honor standpoint, and if we can do some AEW as well, because there's been some really good stuff that they've main evented with as well.
Yeah, and even as we're recording this in early or mid 2024, the stuff they're booking out for the rest of the year looks really interesting. So we may hit some real contemporary stuff as we go through. The point is, there's not going to be like a specific time frame, but I do think we can tell everybody what our first episode is going to be, because it's a big one, and I think it's one we agreed. If you're going to talk about main events with modern professional wrestling, it's got to start with this one.
Absolutely. The first show we're going to do is Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant from WrestleMania 3. And the reason being that this really was the first one you could say was a true main event that sold the show, right? Before that, you had the rock and wrestling connection thing going on. You got other things like that. But before that, the main events of shows were not. It wasn't much pay-per-view at the time, so it would tour the circuit. In the Bruno Sammartino days when he was wrestling Superstar Billy Graham, he was wrestling him 50 times a year. Mm-hmm. And the main event would be, I guess, the Madison Square Garden show. In many cases, the Boston Garden show, Philadelphia, all that kind of stuff. But they'd tour that. With WrestleMania 3 and Hogan versus Andre, they built that up so big, and you didn't get to see it anywhere else. That was the only place you're going to see that match happen. And that really was, I think, the birth of what we call the modern main event. And that's why we're going to start with Hogan and Andre. I'm really looking forward to talking about that. It's a classic. Everybody knows that match. Everybody knows that match.
Yeah, every time they promo WrestleMania, you see the crescendo of that match in a clip. Like they will show that forever because, as you say, it wasn't something you got to see anywhere else. It was that moment and that time, and they, the old tour days, the big blow off would be the Garden Show or whatever it might be, right? And that was the one that they would talk about. But this is pre-internet. What newspaper coverage was just localized, so it wasn't like you were getting the paper out of Chicago if you lived in Dallas or something like that. So there's no way to know this stuff back in those days unless you were reading some of the magazines and stuff, and let's face it, they were all writing to try to get you to come to the show too. So it was all about, we gotta never forget that wrestling is a carny business, and it's about selling tickets and trying to get people in the door. And the first two WrestleManias, those main events were big deals. They were star-studded. They were multifaceted and stuff. But it's with WrestleMania 3 that they really figured out, like, oh, this is how you tell a story, and you keep these guys circling each other until they get in that ring and they do the thing. It's very much like a boxing match would be. I think McMahon and company even borrowed from the idea of the way Muhammad Ali would set up his main events in the late 70s and everything like that. It was all kinds of press tours and stuff, but then the action happened at the fight. And that's a big one to start with, and it'll be a lot of fun to parlance out with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's one of my earliest memories as a wrestling fan, watching or getting excited for that. And like you said, we didn't have pay-per-view at my house, so the only way I was going to see it was to wait for that video cassette to come out.
Coliseum clamshell.
And the hard part was back then is like everybody wanted it. The video stores had one copy, and so you'd have to go in and hope that it was available for you to rent, and it would take months to get. By that time, SummerSlam was coming out or whatever else, you know. So it was a hard thing to do. I never got to see it right away, but I remember when I first got that video cassette, I didn't even know who won at that point, right? Because WWF's programming was taped so far in advance that it's just not always readily available sharing the results of things either. And so I put that cassette in, and I watched it with sheer glee as I was taking it all in for WrestleMania 3. Remember the Tito Santana, the Can-Am connection, Tito and Rick Martel versus
and again, I'm the Steamboat Mark. Yeah. Steamboat and Macho Man tear the house down for that Intercontinental match. So yeah,
I could still pop that on the WWE Network, and once that Can-Am connection music hits, right, I'm taken back to being a kid again. It's one of those events that just takes you back. So I'm super pumped that we're going to cover that match.
I am too. And then we promise, because we're not going to tease it all out, but we're going to jump timelines and stuff. We're going to go from that one to something very recent, just shortly thereafter. So it's going to be a lot of fun here on the Main Event Maniacs. You'll find this show in this very feed, the Juicebox feed, from time to time. So feel free to connect with Juice on his socials. You can follow him on Twitter at Juicy Steen, Instagram at Juicy Wrestling Closet, or subscribe on YouTube at Juicy Steen. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, and if you can swing by iTunes and Spotify and leave a rating and review, that helps a lot of people. We want to do that. We really thank Juice for letting us have this platform to do this. It's going to be a lot of fun, Brian. I can't wait to get into this with you and really break down some of these big main events.
Yeah, I'm pumped. We're going to have a great time with this. And again, as we get this going, we highly recommend reaching out with some main events that maybe you want to see covered too. We're always willing to add things to our list and cover things that people want to hear.
Yeah, it's going to be a great time, man. Can't wait to get into it. So, again, keep subscribed here to the Juice Box. You'll be getting episodes of Main Event Maniacs coming very soon, and we're excited to do it. So for Brian, I'm Jay. Until next time, this has been your Main Event.
That was The Juice Box with Juice Springsteen. Make sure to subscribe to The Juice Box wherever you listen to podcasts.